All to tonight's event, Race in a Glass Nation, Fragility and Dissent in the University and Beyond. I am going to be your MC tonight along with Lynn Jones, right here. And I want to begin first of all by, and first and foremost, by acknowledging the Mi'kmaq people, who are the rightful keepers of the unceded lands on which King's and Dalhousie University are situated, as are Mount St. Vincent and St. Mary's University. We have representatives from those two universities as well presenting tonight. And I also want to acknowledge the mutual relations and obligations that we all must uphold pursuant to the peace and friendship treaties which bring us together as peoples and which are recognized in both Mi'kmaq and Canadian laws. In a few moments, we'll be asking Aaron Prosper, who is Mi'kmaq, a Mi'kmaq student leader at Dalhousie, to offer a welcome to you all. But before that, Lynn and I want to take care of a few preliminaries and give a little bit of context on the logistics for the forum. So my name is Brian Noble. I'm an associate professor of sociocultural anthropology at King's sister institution, Dalhousie, just next door. I'm a settler Canadian. Of Irish descent on my father's side and Ukrainian descent on my mother's side, and coming from working roots in both cases, including fishing people from the Anishinaabe territories of the Georgian Bay Area in Ontario, what we now call Ontario, railroad workers in Alberta, northern Alberta, where my grandfather worked with Cree and Blackfoot workers. My own research and teaching is concentrated mostly in the area of decolonizing the relations between Canada and the Indigenous peoples of this settler state, Canada, that most of us take as our home, or as some leading scholars have put it, our home on Native land. I'm very honored to have been invited by the organizers, who at their core are a highly committed, brave group of women who are Black, Indigenous, or people of color, who asked me to lend my support for their efforts in generating what promises to be a very potent conversation today with a group of outstanding speakers on the subject of race in a glass nation, fragility and dissent in the university and beyond. The organizers of the forum are seeking in particular to bring together a diversity of universities and communities in Kjipuktuk, or Halifax. Kjipuktuk is the proper Mi'kmaq name of the place we are living, to responsibly think through and interrogate institutional capacities in relation to race, to nation, regulation of speech, and other colonial relations within Canada, this predominantly white settler nation. The organizers, as with our presenters, are all people who recognize and support the need for historically marginalized folks subject to these histories of ongoing colonialism, to have a venue which is safe for them, and especially those from the margins presenting here today, to speak what they wish to speak and to do so without threat. As the event poster poignantly illustrates, there has been and remains a problem on our campuses and in wider societal circuits of the silencing of those who are of color, particularly women of color, by the workings of the institutional environments in which we study and do our jobs. We are here to interrogate the problem of that silencing, to get at that which underpins it and perpetuates it in our institutions, including university policies such as codes of conduct, which should not only be for students but for administrators and others working in our institutions, and how such processes and their effects are linked to and too often sustain white settler colonialism and other historical and current hegemonic power structures. To analyze and assess these events outside these structures has proven itself to create flawed and irresponsible decisions, ones that serve to exacerbate and deepen the problems rather than to alleviate them. These are tough matters to unpack and to describe with care and precision. And I really want to honor all of our speakers who in many ways are speaking about very hard topics and who are making themselves vulnerable in actually coming forth and speaking here. So We appeal to everyone in the audience to honor these voices respectfully so that we can move this vital conversation forward in a way that will help to transform our institutional environments into ones that uphold the strongest possible forms of non-racist, anti-colonial, gender and race diverse, and highly accessible practices in our institutions. From the standpoint of facilitating such safety in presenting and discussing, one of my roles will be to watch that there are not uninvited disruptions to the proceedings that would in any way limit our speakers from presenting to you, and I will be respectfully intervening should any such disruptions arise. And to that end, we also have safety monitors on hand in the audience who will be assisting us in assuring against such disruptions. Lynn Jones, I believe, has a few further thoughts and points to raise, so I'll invite Lynn forward.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you. Listen, I want to tell you, I am so excited about this event. I truly am. This is, well, first of all, I should say, I'm an African Nova Scotian who comes from one of the original, I think, and Miss Barbara, Doctor, can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was 53 African Nova Scotian communities in Nova Scotia, and we're now dwindled down to less than 30 for many of the reasons that we're going to be talking about tonight. So it all connects. I'd also like to say this is, I attended this university many moons ago. But I can, and if any of you who are out and about know about all the activism that takes place from all kinds of different perspectives in this community. But I would like to commend the organizers, the presenters, the guest speakers that have traveled. Most of all of you who are here tonight. I don't know about you, but this is my very first public forum that dares to address fragility and dissent in the university and beyond. So that is, yes. Yes. And the only way that we're going to do something about it is being brave enough to stand up, be counted, speak out, and do all the things that need to be done, not to succumb to the fears, to the capitalists. I love this word now because I just attended Solidarity Halifax, and they told me you have to be an anti-capitalist to be here. And I said, oh, okay. I never really have put all these titles on all this activism that I've been doing all those years. But next week, maybe it will be you have to be a socialist. I'll be there too. So whatever name they put on that fits in with the kinds of things that we're doing, that's just fine with me. Without further ado, I will actually move on to doing some housekeeping announcements, because you don't want to hear all of us continue to speak. So I've been asked to point out the washroom facilities, which are upstairs. Thank you very much. There is an elevator for those who have who are persons with disabilities or anything that you can take. But if you're a person with disability and you end up down here in this area that I'm in, there's no elevator to get you up to there. But somehow or the other, we'll make it to the elevator. Childcare is also available. It's upstairs. Take the elevator 1 floor up. You know what? I had a smile when I came in because I actually heard the sound of a baby or a child. Are they still here? Or have they gone to the childcare? It's always so beautiful because it makes us really understand that all this work and what we're doing, it's for us, but also it's for all those generations to come. There's refreshments over here, they said 2 corners. Is there refreshments on that side too? Oh, refreshments over there too. And this is the good part, is that this event will now, as of right now, be live streamed. And it's going to be live streamed until the completion of the keynote, after the keynote and the questions and answers. After that, it won't be live stream. Just for the keynote and the questions and the answers. So if you don't want to be a movie star, I suggest you might want to wait out in the hallway and miss everything. And I don't know what happens from there. So without further ado, thank you very much, and enjoy your evening.
So thank you, Lynn. You've converted me. I hereby declare I'm an anti-capitalist too. All right. So at this stage, I want to invite Aaron Prosper to come forward. We're grateful to have Aaron here today to do the Mi'kmaq welcome. Aaron is from Eskasoni First Nation, which is in the region called Unamagi, which corresponds to what we call Cape Breton Island. He's enrolled in his 3rd year of the Bachelor of Science in Medical Sciences program at Dalhousie. Aaron's main field of research includes behavioral neuroscience, epigenetics, and indigenous health. He's worked with Mi'kmaq communities as a youth mentor, mentoring the Mi'kmaq Gina Matwene Newe Red Road Project. You get it right for me, right, Aaron? The Native Alcohol and Drug Abuse Counseling Association. So thank you very much, Aaron, if you could come forward.
Does this one work? No? Okay. Can you hear me? Great. I'm going to sing at some point, so yeah. Oh, I see it. Great, thank you. Well, while we get that set up, Wildasi dantel bijidayo, Wildasi dantel jiksudio, Jalasi jibuktuk, Jalasi guohamiktuk. Oh, it works. Hello.
No.
Hello. Okay, we'll just go with this. Scratch that. No, we're good. Sorry for the mishap. Okay, so I said, thank you for being here. Wildasi dantil bijidayo, Wildasi aij gluk desio bijidayo. I'm happy to see so many people here. Welcome to Jabukduk. Or the actual traditional name is not Jabukduk. That's the common belief. It's actually Guohamikduk. Guohamikduk refers to the actual peninsula that we're on. Jabukduk is a more generic term for all of Halifax, or the HRM, meaning the Great Forest, but the actual spot that we're on, and it goes right down to Point Pleasant Park, Guohamikduk, which means the Great Pine Forest. And you'll actually see when you go down to Point Pleasant Park, all of the old pine trees, that came all the way up to the north end at one point before before we settled. And that actual geography of the land existed all across Mi'kma'ki. And there's actually a geneticist in Cape Breton University by the name of Steve Manley who talks about how during settlements they wanted the place to look like Europe. And so there was mass wildfires of the forest, and then a replanting of European trees in around Mi'kma'ki. And so the trees you see now that we think are native to Nova Scotia are actually genetically native to Europe. And so, you know, the traditional landscape was what you see in Point Pleasant Park, and more so what you saw in Point Pleasant Park prior to Hurricane Juan. And that's what it looked like. And so our name is Guohamikduk. Guohamikduk. And so I wanted to share that because I often hear, you know, we're in Jabukduk in this region, and in my mind I say, no, we're in Guohamikduk. and that is the proper name for the peninsula. And so I wanted to share that. And so I know I have only a few minutes, and so I wanted to open this up in a good way. And so I want to, thank the committee for inviting me and for having me here and allowing me to open. I'm going to open with a jigaman. And so this is our traditional tool for noise making. It's a beat. It holds no cultural significance in the sense it doesn't represent anything. What it represents is the time when our culture, our tradition was illegal through the Indian Act. And so what we used to do is pound a piece of ash and make it into splints, just like this. And that if the Indian agent came into the house or onto the reserve, the family would just simply break it apart, throw it in the fire, and you would never know that you were playing your traditional songs. That's how we saved a lot of our language. And I don't have a drum with me today because I actually gifted my drum this past weekend. I gifted my drum to these Guatemalan women, Mayan Kekchi women in Toronto when I went to visit them. And they were in Toronto again in a court case against a Hut Bay mining company. And I wanted to recognize that, and the reason why I don't have a drum, I want to recognize that and why I gifted that to them. Those women, their land was completely destroyed from a Canadian mining company, completely destroyed. Their women were gang raped. The chief of their community was shot and killed. I met her husband in Toronto. And so to think that the atrocities of Canadian government only exist in Canada, it has actually extended into South America, into the Guatemalan people in Guatemala and further south. And so I want to recognize that. And so I gave that drum to, in the hope that they would have strength. They've gone through, this is years of the Hut Bay Mining Company and going to court against them. The Canadian government has essentially been silent on this issue. And I want to recognize that, that there are issues in the Canadian government beyond Canada. And so when you think of reconciliation, it extends beyond Canada. And then also, given the recent events here on our campus, I know it can be very polarizing and we can have different opinions. But in my community, that's what reconciliation is about. Is that we are going to have differences. It's going to be polarizing. And none of our elders, Nora Bernard, when she put forward the TRC, never said that this was going to be easy. The Canadian government never put forward the TRC. It was Nora Bernard, it was every survivor that followed Nora Bernard and her lead to have that class action lawsuit put against the government. And there was a settlement in 2007 that resulted in the TRC. That is how the TRC came about. It was pushed by the survivors. And so my message is, often we talk about indigenizing the academy. And people say, well, the TRC says to indigenize. Not one word in the 94 calls to action says to indigenize. And there's often a misconception as to what that means. And so I agree with some tenets of indigenization, but I don't agree with how it's perceived. And that I want to share. Essentially, we don't ask for individuals to change who they are. We don't ask for the academy to become indigenous because the academy as a structure, its base can never be indigenous, in my opinion. It is always the structure's colonial in its basis. What we ask in the TRC is to make the space for people to be indigenous. To make the space to let other people, besides indigenous people, to be who they are. And so with the recent events I want to say reconciliation will not always happen between Indigenous person and non-Indigenous person. It just so happens the TRC looked at those who went through the worst of this country. And through that, we were able to learn how to make this country a better country. And within all of that, everything that surrounds that, are our relationships with others in this country. And so I asked to think of that not everything is, black and white, Indigenous, non-Indigenous. My teachings are, nobody can tell you what your road is in reconciliation. It is up to the individual to decide where that road is and at what part of the road they're on in reconciliation. And so I want to communicate that we're all on different spectrums, but to respect that, to recognize that, and we all have a common necessity. By virtue of being here in Canada, we should all look at the TRC, not just to reconcile with Indigenous people, but with other people in the country. For example, the Chinese tax head laws. That was actually placed in writing on January 1st. That is the anniversary of the Chinese head tax law, our Canada Day. And so I want you to think that. And so with that, I know I'm running out of time and I know I'm going on. So I'm going to sing a song. And what I'm going to sing is a treaty song. I won't sing any drum songs because I don't have a drum. But again, as I sing, remember those women that I gifted those drums to. Remember those women. That's who I'm praying for, because they're still in hearings this week. There's 4 this week. There was 3 last week. There's 4 more next week. So I want you to remember those women that are sharing their stories to try to find civil, to find resolution to their case. And so I pray for that. And so with that, I'll sing a treaty song. You don't have to stand up. Guanaleha guanodaya he, guanaleha guanode, guanaleha guanode, guanaleha guanodaya he, ahe o, de oka. Guanade aguanodaya he, guanade aguanode, guanade aguanodaya he, ahe o, igo, igane, igo, igana. Guanade aguanodaya he, guanade aguanode, guanade aguanodaya he, ahe o. Taho, undasi dan diljik studio, undasi bejayo. Thank you. Taho.
At this time, we'd ask that if you have cell phones, if you would please Do your thing. With your cell phones. Timekeeper? Are you timekeeping? Who's timekeeping? Okay. I'd just like to apologize before I introduce our guest speaker this evening, because I will be leaving following the question and answer period. So unfortunately, I won't be there for the remainder, but everybody's promised to fill me in. So thank you. It is indeed my pleasure and my honor to introduce my sister, Dr. Sanera Tobani. And I'm going to give you the formal introduction, but I'm going to do a little insert in the middle of it. Dr. Sanera Tobani is an associate professor in the Department of Asian Studies and the Institute of Gender, Race, Sexuality, and Social Justice at the University of British Columbia. Her scholarship focuses on critical race, post-colonial and feminist theory, globalization, media, citizenship, and migration, and Muslim women and the war on terror. Her book, Exalted Subjects, Studies in the Making of Race and Nation in Canada, was published by the University of Toronto Press in 2007, and she has co-edited Asian Women, Interconnections, Canadian Scholars Press, 2005, and States of Race, Critical Race Feminist Theory for the 21st Century, Between the Lines in 2010. She served as the director of the Race, Autobiography, Gender, and Age, the Raga Center at the University of British Columbia from 2008 to 12, where she organized numerous projects on equity, diversity, and social justice. She is a founding member of the Researchers and Academics of Color for Equity, which is called RACE, a cross-Canada network that promotes the scholarships of academics of color and Indigenous ancestry. Dr. Tobani was the Ruth Wynne Woodward Endowed Professor in Women's Studies at Simon Fraser University from 1996 to 2000. She's also past president of the National Action Committee on the Status of Women, which was called NAC, Canada's then largest feminist organization from 1993 to 1996. This is my little break here. Because if you notice, she was president of the National Action Committee. And I can well remember when Sanera got elected in 1993. Was I there? No. But I was across the street. Because while the NAC conference was taking place, that was really a historic occasion, because never before had a person of color been elected to such a prestigious position. And it was just after Judy Rebick was president of NAC. So while Sanera was getting elected across the streets, I was in the hotel across the street with the Canadian Labour Congress, and I don't even know if she remembers this. And shortly, not long before that, I had become the first person of color, black women, to be elected to the Canadian Labour Congress. I was on the floor of the Canadian Labour Congress and critically challenging what was taking place at the time, where the women of color were excluded in that women's conference that was taking place across the street and was totally under attack. Sanera came in, just got elected, was brought over to the Canadian Labour Congress and saw that I was under attack. Senator, without being asked, went and ran for the mics. I think literally ran for the mics and condemned the whole conference as to how they were treating a woman of color when what she was doing was fighting for the rights of women. So I'm publicly thanking, which I've done many times, Senator, my sister, for that. She has helped organize and spoken at numerous international conferences, including the NGO Forum at the United Nations Fourth World Conference on Women in Beijing, China, the first International Women's Conference on APEC in Manila, Philippines, the first Asian Pacific Women's Conference in the United States, and the National Association of Black, Asian, and Ethnic Minority Counselors, and the Black Feminist Conference in the UK. Halifax, we are indeed privileged and honored to have Dr. Sunira Tobani talk to us this evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I will try my best to live up to that introduction. Thank you. That was a very, very welcoming welcome. Thank you. I'm very grateful that you do remember those stories. And of course, NAC and the CLC went on to organize Thank you. Of course, NAC and CLC then went on to organize the Women's March Against Poverty that went right across this country. So it's nice to, remember those events because generally, as tends to be the case with most of the activism of women of color, we're written out of the history books of this country. So it's good to remember those, those solidarities. Yeah. So I would like to begin by acknowledging that we are on Indigenous territory here, all across Canada, all across North America, all across the Americas. Here tonight on Mi'kmaq territory, the university I come from, the University of British Columbia, is on Musqueam territory. And I make this acknowledgement in solidarity with Indigenous people's struggles for sovereignty. It is also a recognition that justice remains unattainable in Canada for anybody so long as it is denied to Indigenous peoples. I would also like to begin by thanking the organizers for inviting me here to speak at this event. Many, many thanks for honoring me, and also many thanks to the volunteers who must have worked very hard to put together this event at very short notice. The circumstances which bring us here tonight, of course, are unfortunate indeed. The issues to be addressed at this forum are extremely serious. Indeed, these issues go to the very core of the global crisis that we are living through. Colonialism, racism, war, violence. These issues are also very, very divisive, as is the case in Canada and around the world. Yet it is a matter of the greatest urgency that we address them as clearly and as effectively as we can. Doing this work, however, requires risk-taking and a great deal of courage. For this work requires standing up to the power of the institutions that we seek to transform. It also means being subjected to retaliation from those who benefit from the power invested in these institutions. The courage this work requires needs to be recognized by us all. The people doing this work need to be valued, supported, and nurtured. So I will want us to recognize the extraordinary courage and bravery of the students at Dalhousie University who have demonstrated such a clear determination to contest settler colonial practices and who refuse to be contained in the space that they are assigned by the very relations of power that they are challenging. So I want us a keen sense of uncompromising resilience has been expressed by these students, including Masuma Khan, and also by the faculty and community members who have supported this activism on campus. The sense of solidarity that is visible across the country by those of you facing up to the attacks on these students, on Masuma, on yourselves, is an inspiration to many of us. You have stood up, spoken out, and broken through the silence and the chilly climate that prevails in Canadian institutions with regard to issues of race, racism, and settler colonialism. The risks you have taken are immense, and it is inspiring to see how steadfast you have all remained in your commitment. It is an honor to be here among you tonight. What I would also like to say is, although the issue gets framed as the issue of dissent, I want to underscore that in the present context of white supremacist mobilizing and organizing across Canada, the work that you are all doing is standing in the front lines of contesting these white supremacist politics. So I think we need to go beyond thinking of what you are doing on this campus as dissent. You are actually standing in the front lines against the rise of white supremacy. So, you all probably know much more about the events on this campus than I do. The motion brought to the Dalhousie Student Union Council to opt out of Canada Day celebrations. This event was defined as a celebration of ongoing colonialism of Indigenous peoples, should not have become a controversy. This position should not have caused the kind of havoc that it has on this campus. Indigenous scholars and activists have forwarded an extensive and powerful critique for a long time of Canada Day celebrations of Confederation. A fine expression of this position can be found in the recent collection that was just published, Surviving Canada. The title tells you a lot about what the Indigenous writers whose work is included in that collection have to say about these celebrations. The subtitle of this collection is Indigenous People Celebrate 150 Years of Betrayal. Again, this should not be controversial. The question asked by the writers in this collection is, what exactly are we celebrating? But at Dalhousie, such a position was found to be intolerable. The students who supported this position were subjected to attacks and harassment, including Masuma Khan. Masuma, of course, refused to back down, stating her refusal to, and I will quote from a Globe and Mail story, she stated her refusal to, quote, stand with privileged white people, or to be, quote, proud of celebrating 400 years of genocide. Now, none of this should be controversial. The controversy that followed her statements, the complaints made by other students, and Masuma's refusal to capitulate to the power of whiteness was compounded by the threat of disciplinary action against her from Dalhousie University. Again, quote, for targeting white people. The university's response seemed to have centered more on how Masuma stated her refusal to back down, rather than the issues that were actually raised and that were the issues that had to be taken up. This has become a typical response, a non-response response from universities to probably the most important political question of our times. How can we transform a nation, indeed an entire global order that is founded on white supremacy, colonialism, and slavery? How to end settler colonialism and racism when both are so profoundly entrenched in Canada's institutions? In this country, there seems to be a belief that this has already been accomplished through official multiculturalism and through the process of a reconciliation based on the assumption that settler colonialism is no longer an issue in Canada. There is an eagerness across the country, one feels this very strongly on university campuses, to reconcile and move on. The controversy at Dalhousie has to be situated in the context of how Canadian society deals with questions of race, settler colonialism, and racism, how the university, an institution that is at the heart of this society, deals with these issues, and finally, how anti-racist and anti-colonial activism is challenged in practice. It is these issues that I want to address in my presentation this evening. So, how does Canadian society deal with race, settler colonialism, and racism? In all of the work that I have done to raise these issues at public forums, in the media, there is a common response that Canadians are uncomfortable talking about race. Yet Canadians are more than willing to talk about race and racism, even white supremacy, when it comes to discussing these issues in other sites, such as the United States. There is no shortage of public and political discussion about race and racism in the US, about the rise of xenophobic and ultra-right nationalist movements, and about overt and rigorous assertions of white supremacist ideology. In this case, Canadians do not seem to be at all uncomfortable in talking about race and racism, nor are they reluctant to talk about the rise of anti-immigrant, anti-refugee racism across Europe. It is talking about race and racism in Canada that makes Canadians uncomfortable. Now, we have to, of course, unpack this category of Canadians, because when this refusal to talk about race and racism is expressed, it is expressed in the name of all Canadians. Now, there are a great many Canadians in this room, as I see tonight. So clearly, there are also Canadians who are not uncomfortable talking about race and racism. But what we don't see publicly, what we don't see as a political configuration, is groups of people who identify themselves as Canadians, and Canadians, of course, is a racialized category, and who have made it a priority to organize against racism. And that is what allows statements to be made about all Canadians being uncomfortable talking about issues of race and racism. So if we take this discomfort at face value, for the moment at least, is the expectation that talking about race and racism in Canada should be a matter of making Canadians feel comfortable? What would talking about race and racism accomplish if this was to be done in a manner that increases the comfort level of Canadians? More comfortable Canadians? Should that be the objective of anti-racist organizing? What such a preposterous response does is that it sets the parameters for the non-discussion of race and racism in public and in political discussion. This response neutralizes the question of race it banishes the issue of racism from public and political consideration. The question for us then becomes to understand how this discomfort has the power to make the subject of racism taboo within Canadian society. Discomfort is a response powerful enough to shut down anti-racist and anti-colonial politics and activism, to cast those who raise these issues as the source of the problem, as causing trouble for an otherwise comfortable society. This response transforms anti-racist and anti-colonial scholars, critics, and activists into the aggressors, into the source of the disharmony. And in any case, who are these Canadians who are uncomfortable with discussions of race and racism? Here we see how even this claim that Canadians are uncomfortable talking about race is a process of reproducing whiteness. The anti-racist activists who organize No One is Illegal are not uncomfortable talking about these issues. Those who organize and lead movements against anti-black racism, including Black Lives Matter, are not uncomfortable talking about these issues. The Idle No More activists who raised Indigenous activism to unprecedented heights were not uncomfortable talking about these issues, nor are the Muslim women organizing a chartered challenge against the anti-burqa legislation in Quebec and the other Muslim women who are standing up against Islamophobia. They are not uncomfortable talking about race, racism, and systemic racism. Nor are the many victims of hate crimes who have reported these attacks, and the Statistics Canada report that just came out showed that hate crimes have escalated in Canada, and that 60% of these hate crimes are now directed against Muslim women. So if we have these attacks that are taking place and people are standing up, they are not afraid or reluctant to talk about race and racism. So are we to take it that they are not Canadians? Or are we to take it that they are not real Canadians, right? The category Canadian thus encodes whiteness in a way that seems to be perfectly acceptable to those who would use it as a shield to shut down the activism and knowledge production of those of us who live with the daily aggressions, humiliations, and violence that give race its specific meaning, that give settler coloniality its particular valence. The history of Canada is the history of race. It is the history of colonialism. Canadian sovereignty was created through the dispossession of the territories of Indigenous peoples. It was also produced through the settler states' control and policing of the borders of the nation in organizing its hierarchies of power, citizenship, and entitlement. Today, the ability to shut down discussions of racism and colonialism is part of that white entitlement. So to say that Canadians are uncomfortable with discussions of race is to say that Canadians are quite comfortable forgetting their own history of the constitution of white racial power and of its reproduction in the present. If Canadians can't talk about racism and coloniality within mainstream society, what is the situation like in the university? The institution where Canadians are educated, where knowledge is produced, where the elites and the managing classes are produced. This brings me to my second point, namely the university's treatment of race and colonialism. In my experience, the situation here is more, not less disturbing. Indeed, the university is often even more inhospitable than other institutions in Canada on these matters. It would not be an exaggeration to say that the Canadian university is in a state of crisis over issues of race, colonialism, and imperialism. The shocking manner in which administrations have responded to the presence of anti-racist and anti-colonial scholars and activists, to the knowledges we produce, and to our leadership potential reveals the powerful issues that are at stake. The university is, of course, at the center of the organization of the social world, its forms of governance, its economic, scientific, and technological advances. This institution organizes, informs, and gives shape to the practices of inclusion, violence, and dispossession. It has historically organized and legitimized settler colonial practices and the politics of indigenous erasure. It has also shaped and legitimized the forms of dehumanization that shape citizenship, national belonging, and national values in Canada. In a recent collection, Chatterjee and Myra have named the university the Imperial University, and they have argued that the university is a, quote, particularly charged site for debates about nationalism, patriotism, citizenship, and democracy in the post-9/11 era. This is no less true of the Canadian University, where universities are not only involved in the development of areas such as terrorism and security studies, they are also leading the branding of Canada as a model multicultural polity. In the post-9/11 period, the university has legitimized Canada's participation in the war on terror, in the occupation of Afghanistan, including in the progressive disciplines that have produced the figure of the Muslim woman as an oppressed object to be saved by imperialist war, by invasion, and by occupation. In this climate, anti-racist and anti-colonial activism on campus, particularly when it is led by Muslim women, presents a particularly volatile and powerful challenge. Chatterjee and Myra have also argued that there is a crisis of academic freedom on campuses. You are living through one yourself right now. They argue that this crisis of academic freedom is linked to the larger cultural wars, and although particular incidents may be sparked on particular campuses, this crisis is also a reflection of the politics on campuses where, quote, administrative policing flexes its muscles along with the batons, chemical weapons, and riot gear of police and SWAT teams, and where containment and censorship of political critique is enacted through the collusion of the university, partisan off-campus groups and networks, and the state, end of quote. This analysis should be familiar to many of us, as more and more Canadian campuses become embroiled in this crisis of academic freedom, and as administrations attempt to quash and derail anti-racist and anti-colonial activism. Many of these administrations are deepening their institutionalization of equity and diversity policies to derail and contain anti-racist struggles. Administrations recognize full well that equity and diversity, as presently practiced in the Canadian University, buttress the university's highly entrenched Eurocentrism and its culture of institutional whiteness. Moreover, the equity and diversity regime dovetails nicely with the neoliberal globalization of the nation state and the accompanying corporatization of the academy. Equity and diversity policies provide lucrative opportunities for marketing the Canadian University as global and thus well-equipped to produce global citizens. In this context, the counter-hegemonic scholarship and political activism of people of color and those of indigenous heritage, indigenous peoples, becomes a deeply unsettling problem. The presence of Muslim bodies of color in this activism sparks a particular anxiety, for she challenges the institutionalization of Islamophobia, an ideology that is now dominant in global politics. The potential of these political alliances on an anti-settler colonialism, anti-racist, and anti-imperialist platform could prove to be a nightmare. These politics are already contesting the Eurocentrism of the university, the enhancement of solidarities between indigenous peoples, faculty and students, indigenous students, students of color and faculty of color. These alliances have the power to fundamentally transform the institution itself. These alliances, of course, cannot be built on the collapsing of the power hierarchies between these communities. Those power hierarchies have to be addressed. They have to be front and center to any political alliance. But this political alliance has the potential to fundamentally transform the meaning of Canada. In the Canadian university, as in Canadian society, the approach to dealing with issues of racial injustice and settler coloniality is to first deploy the discourse of multiculturalism and reconciliation, equity and diversity, to override the actuality of racialization, racism, and settler colonial practices. Second, to insist the institution will define what is race and racism and racialization, not the scholars and students of color or of indigenous ancestry who spend their entire academic careers, who spend their entire activist history contesting these issues. And third, that the power hierarchy in this institution will treat any discussion of race, racism, and settler colonial practice as a personal affront, as an insult to their own good intentions. So this is what we face in the university in dealing with issues of race, racialization, and the reproduction of settler colonial practices. So the challenges that you have experienced here in standing up to these issues. With regard to this activism, as raised in the Dalhousie case, I want to discuss two main challenges, both of which have been brought up in the student complaints that were made against Masuma Khan. The first is the accusation that anti-racism is reverse racism. And the second, that multiculturalism means that race and racism are no longer an issue in Canada. Anti-racism is not reverse racism. I doubt that there would be a debate on this issue here in this room. One of the charges made against Masuma was that the message that she posted on her Facebook account, quote, was discriminatory toward white people who celebrate Canada Day, end of quote. The investigation of Masuma is reported to have found that, quote, she did not target white people. I suppose we should take this as a good thing. Somebody at Dalhousie seems to have learned something. But why in the first place would the university consider this to be a valid complaint? Who can possibly take seriously the charge who can possibly take seriously the charge that a Muslim student, a young woman, has the power to discriminate against, quote, white people who celebrate Canada Day? That the university would even consider this worthy of investigation speaks to an utter lack of understanding of the society in which this institution functions, or it reflects a partiality towards upholding whiteness. Such an accusation that anti-racism amounts to racism against white people is such a mundane non-response to anti-racist activism. Many of us are sick and tired of having to debunk it again and again and again. I cannot count the number of books, journals, workshops, articles, lectures, community events, marches, protests, and meetings that I have read, participated in, attended, where this point has been cogently and repeatedly debunked, deconstructed, debated, explained, cried over, etc., etc. Anti-racist scholars and activists even came up in the early 80s with a shorthand equation to help educate those who just seem unable to comprehend the point that racism is a relation of power and privilege. The equation was racism equals power. This equation has been circulated for decades now. So, the fact that this most basic understanding of race as systemic, historical, institutional, juridical, social, and psychic is not known to university administrators speaks to their level of competence. To not understand that people of color do not have the status or resources to mobilize systemic and institutional power over white women in Canada is not an innocent stance for any administrator to take. Anti-racism does not equal racism. Yet this argument persists on campuses across this country. It continues to be made and upheld by otherwise particularly sane, rational, reasonable, educated people. So what is going on here? The charge that anti-racism is a form of racism constructs whiteness as victimhood and anti-racism as aggression. The fact that such an argument can gain such traction and garner institutional support demonstrates how little tolerance there is for anti-racist thought, critique, practice, and education on university campuses. It is a policing of students and scholars of color for administrations to take this position seriously. It functions as a threat to people of color, indigenous peoples, and students, that you will be treated as perpetrators and aggressors. The second challenge, and I know I'm running out of time, but I do want to talk about this because these issues keep popping up all across the country. The second challenge to anti-racist activism that has become very clear in the Dalhousie case is that official multiculturalism makes race and racism no longer an issue to think about. And the fact that this position is articulated by students is particularly concerning. Official multiculturalism exists in an uneasy and subservient relation to bilingualism and biculturalism as the defining features of Canadian nationhood, identity, values, and character. This official definition of Canada upholds whiteness as the core of the nation, to construct people of color as defined by their culture only, which is different from the two official cultures of Canada. This culturalizing marks the distance between the real Canadian and those who are multicultural Canadians. Multiculturalism in Canada thus works as a strategy to manage and govern racial and ethnic minorities. The official treatment of the culture of these others as unchanging, the conflation of their culture with race reveals the colonial logics that are at work in the discourse of multiculturalism. Multiculturalism is therefore how race is actually organized in Canada. It is a discourse that produces the difference of the other. It remakes the older biologically determinist discourses of racial hierarchy in the vernacular of culturalist, linguistic, and religious difference and hierarchy. Multiculturalism is thus not anti-racism. Indeed, it is how race is organized in Canada. So, in closing, I would like to underscore the point that if Canadian universities fulfill their mandate of educating students on Canadian history, Canadian politics, Canadian society, students would learn how central colonialism and race are to the making of this country, to its reproduction, and to the making of the global order. It is because universities fail in their mandate that this most elite of Canadian institution that educates the Canadian elite, students can acquire an education, advanced degrees even, without learning the most basic lessons about race, power, and colonialism, or about how whiteness is socially constructed in a manner that pays dividends to those included in the category. As the growing number of incidents on campuses demonstrate, universities do not equip their students with the most basic of knowledge to understand the racial and colonial politics that have plunged the global order into a state of crisis. The attempt to discipline and punish students who are engaged in anti-racist and anti-colonial activism, the personalized nature of these attacks reveal just how threatening the political rearrangement and relationships of solidarity amongst these students can be. The politics of these students are a politics of refusal to collude with settler colonialism. They are a commitment to make Indigenous history, presence, critique, and struggle central in Canada today and central at Canadian universities. If these politics challenge the power of whiteness to set the political agenda, they also contest, even reject, the position of the grateful immigrant that is imposed on people of color. Most important, these politics open up the horizon of possibility for a different future in the context of Indigenous sovereignty and an anti-racist social order. Building alliances and making these political rearrangements work on the ground will make them sustainable. Not surprising, the institutional response is to side with the attacks on these politics of the future, and when that fails, to turn to more equity talk and invisibilize the problem of race and racism. I have heard from some of you this morning about the very high costs exacted from you for doing this difficult work, and yet the necessity of doing this work continues to grow ever more urgent. Taking up these issues for many of us is not just a matter of our research, our teaching, our scholarship. It is a matter of our love for our communities who have made it possible for us to enter the university and who make it possible for us to survive in this institution. This work is the most important and urgent work we are required to take up today. It is a matter of what the future will look like. Thank you very much.
Woo! Wow, fabulous. You do it, you still do it. I'm going to invite you over there to sit and down. Okay, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you. I'm speechless. Another round of applause for Dr. Oh my gosh. Wow. Thank you so much. We'll be able to take probably about 10 minutes of questions and answers at this time, and we're going to be brutal in terms of how we coordinate this part of the discussion. because we'd ask that you limit your talk in terms of just asking questions, or if you do have a comment, that it would be very short and succinct. So, okay, do we have some questions? Go ahead, Doctor.
First of all, I'd like to thank you for a very powerful, inspiring presentation. And I'd just like to say that you're talking about Canadians being uneasy to discuss these topics, whatever we find Canadians as. As someone who teaches in the Black and African diaspora, I teach an introduction to African Canadian studies, and in that I talk about colonialism, the genocide, physical, cultural, of the indigenous peoples, and the existence of slavery of people of African descent in Canada. And my students do not find that uneasy or unacceptable. I also want to commend you for talking about Canada's foreign policy and Canada being part of the global imperial project. That housing at this moment is celebrating the International Security Forum, which is bringing more criminals and more monsters to this very city. And I think it's important that you raise how Canada is implicated in imperialism, implicated in white supremacy. So thank you very much for raising these issues.
Thank you. Is that mic working? Then why are you holding? Can you shout it out? Maybe I can repeat it if we're not hearing. Okay.
I just wanted to add to what Isaac said. Tomorrow afternoon at 1 o'clock, there's an anti-war rally at Peace and Freedom Park, otherwise sometimes known as Cornwallis Park.
Thank you so much. Any on your side, Al? No? Dr. Ifu.
I want to thank you for what you shared. It resonates deeply with me as someone who's been kicked out of institutions like this multiple times for challenging white supremacy. So I guess my question is, do you see an end to this? And as someone who doesn't have kids yet, but will have kids in the future, I cannot fathom sending my kids to experience what I experienced. So the question is, what are we doing to create alternative institutions to educate our kids, since this system is killing us?
Thank you.
So I should say that I actually think the situation is getting worse on campuses. And, you know, I think it's very much connected to Canada's role internationally, to Canada's foreign policy. It also reflects the challenges that have come from Indigenous peoples. I think that is part of the crisis that has been sparked in the Canadian university. I think movements like Black Lives Matter have really put the issue of anti-Black racism on the political agenda. And I think that all of these issues and the movements that have arisen in response to these forms of exclusion, violence, is what has created this crisis of the Canadian university. So unfortunately, I think that things are not getting easier. I don't see them getting easier anytime soon. But I do think I'm very, very inspired by the struggles that are being taken up by students on campuses. To me, that is the hope for change. We have tried to build networks across the country for a long time, but there is a new spark and a new energy that you can feel in what the students are doing on campus. That gives me a great deal of hope. In terms of the institution itself, I don't see what choice there is except to stand up and fight. And I know that it takes a terrible toll from our children. I'm in no illusion about it, having gone through that experience myself. I know how much damage is done to them. And yes, there are alternate institutions, but I don't see a way that allows us to move anywhere without this battle to transform the university as an institution.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions? No, we're okay? Oh. Well, we have one, and then we're going to close.
This is not very well formulated yet, but I've been very frustrated by the way the senior administration at this university has used the language of respect to quash debate.
Yes.
It's happened repeatedly. And I'm looking to you for some advice as to how we can respond to that, to the use of respect as a tool for managing dissent.
Yes. So I think that sounds to me exactly right, is to define this as a tool to manage, govern, and neutralize anti-racist activism. We have to keep calling it that, we have to name it that, and any time that it is raised by the administration, that's the analysis we give them of what they're doing, is they are reproducing institutional whiteness. Respect for whom? Who defines what this respect is? All of this speaks to the deeply entrenched institutional whiteness in the university's culture. So the only thing I can say is to keep naming it as such and not to be derailed because the charge that we are disrespectful divides us. That's what it's meant to do. It sets apart the angry black woman, the angry woman of color feminist, from the good one who will speak politely, who will uphold the norms and values of the institution. So it's a very old strategy, and we know that it is used to isolate and keep apart those who are targeted by this politics of respect and civility. And it is used to demonize them personally. And we have to stand up to those politics because they have become very effective in transforming mainstream discourses about anti-racism and Eurocentrism. So I think we have to name it as such, and we have to show solidarity with those who are demonized, who are isolated by these kinds of accusations.
So, thank you very much. And we're going to close off our questioning at the moment. One last one. I see over here the organizer is.
Thank you very much for the great seminar. My question is, as a racialized woman myself, I left confused. When people in power, where these white institutions back up from some promises, we see the faces of racialized women like us who tell us that. In the case, for example, in the case of Justin Trudeau, backing up from his election promises, we saw Maria Monsif talking about that. In the case of Masuma Khan, we saw Arika Sheba, the face of that housing. And these are racialized women. That left me confused personally. Using our own hands to attack us, that left me confused. What shall we do about this situation?
Yes.
Thank you.
I think we have to, it's a very important point, and I think that it's through the deployment of multicultural politics that this happens, that women of color are set up in the front line against anti-racist activists and activism. And unfortunately, it's a very old colonial practice, divide and rule. So we have to recognize we have a long history of colonization. We understand how these politics work. So we should name them as such. These are all practices of power. These are all practices of colonial racial power. And that's how we have to recognize them. And this is not something new. Even if the extent at which it is now happening across Canada is something that is changing, but it's also changing in relation to the effectiveness of the anti-racist activism. So we have to recognize that it's also a response to the effect that anti-racist politics are having in the institution. And as long as we're clear about that, there's less chance of us being confused by it. It's a very, very old strategy. Yes? And so I think that, you know, and that's why it was important for me to say the things that I did about multiculturalism, because it's a very seductive discourse to young students of color. I see it on my own campus. It's a very seductive discourse. It allows you to be integrated, assimilated, to become what Stuart Hall calls the difference that makes no difference. Right? We have to be the difference that makes a difference.
A final round of applause for our speaker, Dr. Sanera Tabani. And we'll call on Dr. Lenina Bajan to present her with a gift. Thank you so much. At this time, we'd like to call on, where's Dr. L? Where's L? There's L. L. Jones. I don't even get to say the rest of her bio. L. Jones, who is now Halifax-based, is an activist, a journalist, a scholar. My glasses are sitting on the table there. A teacher. She said, "Don't read all of that, so I'm not going to." Activist extraordinaire, poet extraordinaire.